I want to welcome Regine Gilbert, Ximena Vengoecha, and Karel Vredenburg, who are going to be here today to, like I said, go through it all, talk about some of the key themes and topics that we saw today. And, I feel like I'm in great company. We've got writers, educators, practitioners, researchers, designers, and all represented in only 3 people. It's a pretty amazing group here. So we're going to start first with Regine. Regine, welcome. Great to see you.
Hi, everybody.
All right. Regine is a user experience designer, educator, and author with a lot of experience working in technology. Previous to technology, she was even in fashion, which is so cool. She has really lived by the strong belief that the world, to make the world a more accessible place, starts with and ends with users. Her areas of research focus are digital accessibility, inclusive design, and immersive experiences, which were major topics today, Regine. And she is a professor at NYU and author of Inclusive Design for a Digital World, and co-author of an upcoming book on human spatial computing. So cool, so many things to dig into. Regine, I thought maybe I'd start with a topic which is kind of unique in your world. As researchers, we're often given topics to explore and to understand. You need to figure it out on your own where you want to kind of go deep and pursue your curiosity. And I'm curious about how you do that, how you find yourself at the intersection of such interesting topics all the time. How does that happen in your world? How do you keep your curiosity sharp and strong?
Yeah, well, quick story. Before I was a professor, I was a consultant, and I worked in a co-working space, and I got to work next to a group of folks who were working on augmented reality. And they said, we need UX help. And that's kind of how I got into it. And as the years pass, being an academic, you have to write and publish. And I thought, I really like augmented reality. I like virtual reality. I'd co-created some curriculum for some UX for AR and VR courses. And a thought came to my mind, will I be able to use this stuff when I get older? Right? And so that prompted me to start thinking about accessibility and inclusion in this space. And that's kind of how the idea came about. I mean, I already had some interest. I had done some work in it, but researching it has been so interesting.
That's really cool. I feel like serendipity often leads us to such interesting places and being open to the things that we see along the way. So great. We'll definitely be digging into your key 2 topics a little bit later in the session today. Ximena Vengoecha is a researcher, practicing researcher every day, an author, and so much more. Getting a chance to learn about Ximena, you are a creative force of nature, okay? Ximena writes for Fast Company and The Muse. She's an illustrator. She pens her own newsletter. She explores her creative side in her Life Audit project, which is very worth checking out. And last but certainly not least, Ximena is a published author of a great book, Listen Like You Mean It, Reclaiming the Lost Art of True Connection, which I've had a chance to read in preparation for this, and I found really useful as a book for a lot more than just research. And Ximena is currently working on her 2nd book, which will be published in 2023, and will explore the power of rest, which everyone's probably feeling a little sleepy right now, so it's a dangerous place to leave people at the end of a long day here. But Ximena, I'm really curious because your book speaks to a theme that I think we heard so much of today, which is kind of the skills of research are so broad and can be applied so far beyond research. So I'm kind of curious, when you wrote this book, and you've probably gotten feedback from readers, tell us about some stories of the feedback from places maybe you didn't expect to get feedback from in terms of the sorts of things that you were talking about.
Definitely. Thank you. It's great to be here with you all. I think on that topic in particular, when I think about, the sort of origin story for the book was kind of a hypothesis that these listening skills could be applied outside of the UX lab and could be learned and could be applied in your everyday world, either your personal life or your professional life. And so far, it's what I've seen as quite a bit of interest from the business community in terms of like, how do we bring this into the workplace? How do we communicate in hybrid workplaces in particular? What does remote listening look like? Which has definitely been interesting, maybe not surprising. I think the most surprising and perhaps exciting for me has been hearing from folks who are in helping or caring professions and the role that listening plays for them. So everything from doctors to therapists to, I spoke to a consortium of colleges that work on, for example, personal finance. And, these are the people who are guiding college students on things like thinking about loans and debt and budgeting. Money conversations are hard. And so these are folks who are really employing listening in a very specific, kind of tough set of topics in the service of helping someone else. So I really love hearing those kinds of stories of, roles that maybe I didn't even know existed and how listening can help them not just get their job done, but also feel fulfilled as a part of that sort of promise of listening as a means to connection.
All right, well, I was just practicing one of the skills in your book, which was winding down and making sure I was staying present and not jumping forward to think about what the next thing was I was going to say here. So I appreciate already using the feedback from your writing. So our last guest, certainly not our least, is Karel Vredenburg. Karel and I actually got to know each other through a collaboration at Northwestern, kind of teaching some students, and I was blown away in that experience by his wisdom and perspective. But I really shouldn't have been, because after all, Karel brought user experience research to IBM in 1993. It's crazy. We learned earlier that was the year user experience was coined as a field, which is pretty amazing. He's an author, educator, and really a pioneer. He has played critical roles in leading design through so many transitions at IBM, including the introduction of enterprise design thinking starting in 2014. IBM, as many of you know, now employs one of the biggest design teams in the world. I guess if there's some count of that somewhere, it'd be in the, top 5, top 10, something like that. And interestingly, Karel has just stepped down from his global design role into a new role, which is a head of global client insights. So moving from design to research, which was a theme that we've already seen today. So Karel, obviously your story in many ways, I think, is the story of the field in a lot of ways. I'm curious how you see the transition that you've gone through as emblematic of this kind of broader change that we're seeing in the world of user experience.
Yeah, thanks for that, Michael. And first of all, congrats on this whole conference. I speak at a lot of conferences and have put on a number of conferences, and I've been so impressed with this whole day of the presentations, the moderation, and the like as well. And I also would like to observe that over the number of years I've done this, that our profession of user experience research is at an incredible sort of stage at present. There was a time when I would present at conferences and I would at workshops and to get people to put their hands up of the number of people that were the only designer in their company, and 80% of the room would put their hands up. So design actually went through a transformation well before research did. So design was all there, but we still had hands up a number of people that were the only researcher, and that was still often the case. And I think we're now at an ascendancy, I think, with regard to research. And I've been a researcher since I first started in my PhD program, and that's how I was hired into IBM several decades ago. But the focus all the way along, no matter what I was doing, I used the researcher's mindset, right? And I actually, when I introduced sort of design thinking into each of the parts of the IBM company over the last 10 years, I also realized that design thinking a lot of the time wasn't done right because it wasn't informed by user experience research, right? So people would get their, Sharpies and Post-it notes and think they were being really cool. I call that innovation theater. And in order to actually solve the problem of innovation theater, we needed to be focusing on research. And so a new position was created at IBM to do this. So vice president of client insights and research. And the whole focus is to level up the practices of research across the whole company to drive success of the company in terms of identification of new products to build, the improvements that we need to make to products and the like as well. So yes, it really has been a phenomenal journey that our whole discipline's gone through. And I think we are now at that ascendant place where we should be feeling proud that we are now the core foundational discipline for product success and services to success as well, Michael.
Yeah, I think it is such a stunning transition, and in some ways one that, I feel like many of us are still catching up to, because we've been in this field for a while. In some ways, it's always felt like a small discipline in these great big companies and organizations, and the pace of change is so rapid. And in many ways, still the opportunities to apply the skill set are so broad. Ximena, I know that you attended a session today around turning the UX lens inward, which I think is kind of a little bit part of that story. I'm kind of curious about some of the takeaways you had from that session and kind of what it made you think about in terms of where the field is going and how it's changing.
Well, what I loved about that session is it's an example of taking a core research skill and extending it beyond the typical scope. So beyond merely, design, UX, product, and you're applying it instead to the broader organization. And that's super important. There's business needs to do that. There's organizational needs to do that. I don't think you see that at every company yet. I suspect more and more we will see that research is recognized as a skill that can be used more holistically across these different areas of the business, more strategically across these areas of the business. And I think that's really exciting. I think that's a shift from where we are seeing it. I think part of what is enabling that is likely that the function has enough credibility within the organization that they have been given sort of permission to play or permission to extend in a certain way. Which is exciting, and I look forward to seeing more of that, which I think is quite different than some organizations where the research kingdom is quite small or quite confined, and the position of a researcher is more of sort of defending the territory or even explaining the territory. Research is still quite young, so the more that we can kind of shift from, okay, first, we work hard to establish the practice and to establish the function and to gain that credibility, but then sort of looking beyond just protecting it and saying, well, how else can I apply my skills? What else could be useful here? And I think that panel was just a great example of that.
I think the point that you kind of commented on, which is that the field still feels so young, right? Though, and so still early in its own development. Is tricky, back to Karel's point, because we're at this critical juncture where all of a sudden the questions organizations are trying to answer, right? They've turned the light to research, right? Which can be actually scary. Sometimes you're like, oh, people actually are listening now, and they want to know, right? And it places some interesting strains and challenges on the field, right? Especially around a big topic today, which was democratization. I'm curious, Karel, as you look at an organization like IBM that has a large research team, but in the grand scheme of things, probably a pretty small percentage of IBM. How are you thinking about, and kind of what are the things you're thinking about as you're looking at the broader topic of democratization?
Yeah, I think it's key. Democratization in a variety of ways. I would actually characterize the other session that we had as well on sort of the changing relationship with stakeholders. I think that everybody needs to adopt research thinking is the way that I now characterize it. We did design thinking. We still need to go do that, but everybody has to have this research thinking. And that means, a general manager that's responsible for a whole portfolio of products needs to see research as part of their job. They shouldn't just be an advocate. They should own this, and they should be calling for it and driving, the results that we as researchers come up with into products and the like. I think we also need to share, as the sessions talked about as well, the approaches to this. And I think the panel was phenomenal in terms of covering a variety of different perspectives on this, whether it's actually doing part of the research. I think that researchers still should always have kind of the pen or have the training wheels or whatever phrase you want to use to guide kind of what research we're doing.
I think someone called it like
but also
bumpers in a bowling alley today, if I recall, was the metaphor
idea, right?
from this morning. Yeah.
Exactly. So you want to make sure that you're not letting people, dilute it to the point that was talked about earlier. And then you get an appreciation, I think, also for what true researchers bring to the table. So everybody gets a little bit better at this stuff, but you still need to have this fundamental foundational knowledge that I think researchers have, and that's really, really important. But I think it's also the case that even the analysis of the data, as was suggested as well in the panel, is something that should be shared and that people should be doing as well. And some of the best research that I've seen have actually been going out to clients or potential clients with like a product manager and a designer and a researcher together. Sounds like introducing a joke here, but I'm not. The three of them, go into to look at different perspectives of the problem together. And the researcher is really admired, I think, and appropriately given the responsibility to sort of guide how that work is done. But yeah, right. I think we're at a good place with regard to that.
Yeah, I think one theme that really struck me today was how much researchers are leaned on to be teachers. And a lot of people would even argue that it is the main job, right? Is that our job is to teach and to be pedagogical experts. We're lucky to have a teacher and a pedagogical expert here. Regine, I'm kind of curious when you hear some of these comments and you think about teaching the next generation of your students, how do you kind of bring that inquisitive researcher mindset into the classroom? And maybe you could give us a couple tips as we're, so many of us are being tasked with these same sorts of needs or challenges.
Yeah, actually a few weeks ago I gave a talk and I had a GIF of cornflakes on the screen. And I said that, design without research is like cornflakes with no milk, because I think that is very true. In my courses, I start with research. Students don't actually start designing until 8 weeks in of a 14-week course, right? The primary objective is for them to research to see if the problem that they're working on is actually a problem, talk to real users who are using this product, get to understand user behavior, right? Get to understand people's needs. And I think, it's really important to, people want to get into the Figma and the Sketch and make all the things, but you're making what? For who? Without research, you don't know. You have no idea. People have all these ideas of the things they want to build, but for what? Without the research, you have no clue. So, that's what I do, in my courses.
That sounds great. I know, Karel, you talked about that as performative innovation, maybe? Was that what you called it? I think you've always used the term pseudo-design in some of your writing as well. Yes. As kind of like design without research is like cornflakes without milk. I'm curious, I think it brings back to this other kind of theme through the day, which is just how much, for lack of a better word, like how much the world needs what researchers do right now. It feels like research isn't just a process of figuring out the thing that's going to sell or the thing that's going to work, but it feels like in many ways researchers are really asked to make to kind of repair the world in a way. Ximena, I know so much of your writing and thinking is about that. I'm kind of curious about how with that, it also places some pressure on researchers. And I know a big focus of your next writing is about rest and kind of setting boundaries. What tips do you have for the audience around how they can kind of maintain their own energy kind of through this process where they're being asked to often do so much at such a critical intersection inside of organizations?
I think it's a really important question, particularly for those of us who are conducting research that involves a lot of conversation, right? That involves conversation also about tricky subjects. So about money or about health or about loss, right? These are all things that, depending on the area or business you're working in, you might be kind of tasked with not just being the objective researcher, but also the therapist or the coach in a session. And by the way, that happens not just in sessions, but also with your team, right? Because researchers are often the bearers of bad news, the ones who have to say, hey, PM, I know you love this idea, but it's not going to fly for XYZ reasons. And so I do think it's very important for researchers to just be aware of where those, where your limits are. And those limits, you can think about them on a sort of the level of literally how many conversations can I have in a day before I start to feel really exhausted? Are there certain types of conversations that are more draining to me than others? And I should be aware of that and kind of stacking or designing my day accordingly. If I'm not in control of my calendar at all, which is true of some of us, can I at least make space for a 2-minute sort of micro moment of rest where I am just going to close my eyes for 2 minutes and just breathe and just, that's it, and you can do that in the restroom if you need to, right? Everybody has at least those 2 minutes. If you have more time, obviously that's great. Things like journaling, taking walks, having a conversation with someone who can kind of be the listener for you. So switching out of that researcher mode in your personal life and allowing someone else to make space for you, I think is really, really crucial. Whether that's a friend, a partner, a coach, or a therapist, I think it can take many forms. But really being cognizant as a starting point of how your energy is affected throughout your day by these various interactions, and then kind of doing what you can to either prevent yourself from feeling too burnt out, or in the case of listening, I call it getting listener's drain, where you're just so fatigued from all that listening, or finding ways to recover and really knowing which of those recovery techniques work well for you. For some people, it's going to be jogging. It's not going to be jogging for me. I like fiction. I like being in a supine position. But so figuring that out and being aware of, what really works for you as well as your limits.
Hey, Michael, could I just add one other thought to that?
Absolutely.
I think that the individual researchers shouldn't have to do all the lifting on that. I think all that advice you just gave was just perfect, right? But I want to speak to the managers and the leaders and the executives as well, like me. I think we need to actually give our researchers the space and the permission to take that time. My organization created a wellness commitment. That included all kinds of things that we said, look, this is the kind of thing you should be doing. We also gave them time off. But I think we need to be cognizant of what researchers, but especially over the last 2.5 years, been going through as well. But I just wanted to add that thought.
I think it's a great point and actually bridges into, I think, another topic that I think came up a bit today, which is there was, I believe it was in one of the stakeholder panels. I think it was kind of different ways to include stakeholders. And I think one of the panelists, I think, made a great point, which is, we're getting a lot of their time is spent teaching that research is so much more than field work, right? It's this whole process from defining objectives to developing a research plan, asking good questions, all the way through, analyzing findings, synthesizing, sharing out, right? And there's this huge skill set, right? And we kind of talked about the challenges already of, hey, you're not just a researcher, you have to have pedagogical expertise to be a teacher. You've got to be an expert in methodology, storyteller, a logistician, right? And how much is still often on the shoulders of each researcher. I think that, to your point, I think there is this. I think Dev and Harold mentioned in their talk this idea of hey, maybe there's other places where how can the organization actually help so it's not all on the shoulders of a researcher, right? I think is a really interesting question and important thing for the field to be thinking about. So I'm curious maybe to switch gears a little bit and to jump and talk about kind of in some ways one of the most basic themes of the day, which is I heard the phrase a lot around humanizing we're there to humanize experience. We're there to humanize a process or humanize work. Regine, you mentioned some of that obviously in your teaching, and certainly the work that you've done in accessibility is a really visceral and important example of humanization. So maybe you can kind of talk about why that feels so critical right now, and especially when you start thinking about tools like the metaverse, or I don't even know if the metaverse is a tool. I don't know exactly what to call it, right? Anyways, we could spend time on that. How you think that applies?
One of the first things I actually ask my students in the very first class is, what does it mean to be human? Which is something that oftentimes we don't think about. I mean, I think as researchers, we don't ask that question even of ourselves. And so in asking that question, it makes people start to think about their humanity. And to me, that's a really good foundation as to where to start, right? If you start thinking about everything that you do from a human perspective, not, we have to get this done and that done. Yes, of course. But we are all human beings. We all have feelings, and we have to consider that. And so that's one of the things that I think, the themes that throughout the day of talking about humanity. And I think Ximena's book, everybody needs to go and get, because one of the key pieces is listening, right? As researchers, that is a huge part of our job, is to be able to listen, and listening, like anything else, is a skill. It's something I personally have to work on because I can get better. I can be a lot better at it. But I think we have to, one, reflect on our own humanity, understand that we are also dealing with other human beings, and that we can always practice the art of listening.
Love it. Yeah, I think it's it obviously is in some ways the core thing of our field, but it's such a simple question to ask that I've never thought of, which is to simply kind of start asking, what does it mean to be human? And I think it's also the flip side of that, which is, what are the elements in our organization and certainly in our world that we feel like are these forces of dehumanization that in some ways, our field is trying to fight against, for lack of a better phrase, right? And trying to work through, I think is really important. I think I'm curious, maybe Karel, how you think about that. You talked about kind of restorative practices at IBM. Kind of why do you feel like, you mentioned right at the start, right? This is kind of the essence of maybe one of the most important fields, or roles at IBM. Tell me why you think that's so important right now.
I think a lot of, especially technology companies, start to, and they're led typically by either engineers or marketing people and the like, typically not people that are roughly in our field. And so they look at, speeds and feeds and requirements, and everything ends up being kind of dehumanized. And I love the theme of several of the sessions we did today, we heard today, that talked about the importance of video, for example. So it's not just here, you got to read this finding. No, observe it. I mean, I did a pile of work a few years ago where we needed to pivot a whole suite of products. I was responsible for the design of all of them at the time. And of course, I used research to bring to the fore the top 10 sort of gaps to competition. And if I just had listed them in a sentence each, they wouldn't have had anywhere near the power versus actually showing this is a actual user experiencing your product versus there's another experience that is in fact your competitor. It just galvanized the senior executive team and humanized it. Basically, this is what you're causing, right, in terms of the kind of problems that you're experiencing. So I just think that our discipline provides that. I think our discipline also needs to dig in even deeper on a lot of the generative research methods. I think a lot our field kind of started with the kind of the usability testing evaluative work, and that's still important. But I think leaders in companies need to understand that we have the insight and learnings to be able to actually identify whole new product areas and the like as well. I mean, the metaverse discussions were really interesting when we talk about the accessibility features of it. I kept on imagining that we have whole new products that we never had before, or product categories like, ambient audio, which would be absolutely amazing for people that are blind, because the whole interface is you just speak to, right? I'm imagining what could we do if we made, the metaverse, a version of that metaverse that didn't require the visual sense, let's say, right? That would be a phenomenal, innovation for that whole field, right? So I just think that we in the work that we do to understand how people actually work and think and play today can feed a whole industry. And so that's why I think it's not just one of the core disciplines. I think it's the core foundation discipline and what companies need.
I mean, obviously that ties right into, Regine, your work, looking at both accessibility and inclusivity, as well as human spatial computing in areas like the metaverse. I think one of the things that the panel kind of keyed on today, which was interesting, was the idea of obviously starting with inclusive research practices and accessibility at the start of defining new innovation like the metaverse, versus kind of seeing it as an add-on that's done later. I'm kind of curious how these two things, accessibility and human spatial computing, can you talk a little bit about how you see the intersection of those two playing out?
Yeah, so I think a lot of the metaverse and AR and VR has excluded folks with disabilities and others from the very beginning. So there is a lot of work being done to kind of curtail some of that, but there still is a lot of work to be done in that area. And I think it starts with thinking about the fact that folks need options in order to experience things, right? There shouldn't just be something that's visual. There should be the audio component. There should be haptic involved, right? And at the end of the day, accessibility is about options and providing those options and thinking about it. And we've seen it successfully in the gaming field with The Last of Us. It's a very accessible game experience that folks who are blind can play, folks who are deaf can play. And so why aren't we applying that to the metaverse? I think we have a lot to learn from the internet, right? There's a lot of lessons that we can take and apply, those things that didn't work. Why don't we make them work in this new world? We have a great opportunity, I feel, to do that. And so one of the things that I started with when I started doing research was looking at the tools that make experiences and seeing how accessible those were. How many of them mentioned accessibility? Not that many, but I did get to speak to folks at these companies, and they are working on it, but it's still a slow work in progress. And then from a designer and developer perspective, what do they need to know in order to create these experiences, right? There's a huge gap in terms of education as well. So with what people are learning. So there's it's a layered,
Sure.
very layered issue, but I do feel that there is progress being made because people are talking about it at events like this, which is awesome.
That's great to hear. Okay, well, we are going to switch gears a little bit. Obviously, thanks for all your thoughts on what you heard today and kind of how the field is adapting. I want to maybe push a little forward. I asked each one of you to think a little bit about if you had to kind of summarize where the next couple of years of adaptation will be, or where you want it to be, kind of in a word. I'd love to kind of hear your thoughts on that. So, Ximena, maybe we'll start with you.
Sure. So I think as a field, we really have an opportunity to push more on creativity. So I think we tend to, we think a lot about pedagogy, we think a lot about expertise, what is the right sample size, like how do we get our study design exactly right? All of that is great, but I don't think it's enough. And I think sometimes we can get stuck on the rigor and be limited by it, as opposed to saying, yes, let's be rigorous, and what else can we do? What can we do differently here? And I thought actually, Ximena's conversation was a really wonderful example of someone who has so many disparate interests, and they're kind of mixing them up. And what's coming out is completely unique to her, and it is a better version of, a cookbook that, if you just did the standard things, you would come out with. And I think we all have that opportunity. Each one of us is coming with our own interests and passions and skills to bring that unique lens to our work and to think about what we might do differently. Don't lose the rigor, absolutely not. But what else can we do? Because that sort of layer of your thinking, that's the thing that is unique. Mm-hmm. That's the thing that is going to push things further. And I think we need to embrace that as opposed to saying, "Ooh, that's out of bounds," right? So that to me is, I think, a big opportunity.
Right, and it's not just about the fact that it creates more. It keeps you engaged, right? It makes you feel like you're really thinking more sharply when you're kind of applying that creative muscle to the work. Okay, Karel.
Well, and also
just
ahead, to add one thing, it can't be. I think when we talk about the democratization of research, there's sometimes this idea of what will we give to the cross-functional team and what will we as researchers hold? That layer, that creative thinking, that's yours. It's always going to be yours. And so that's the area to really lean into. Absolutely.
Karel, what do you have for us in terms of your word, if you had to sum up where you want to see the field adapt over the next couple of years?
Yeah, I would reinforce the phrase that I used before, that it really should be research thinking, should be the way that which also means that we've got to lean into education more. I'm surprised at where we need to hire researchers from. Right now, there are very few programs that are dedicated to the discipline where you could actually get a major in research. So you have to hire people out of psychology programs or ethnography programs or sociology programs. And I think that we're now at a point in our history in terms of research that we should have an actual discipline at universities to teach this. And a couple of years ago, Don Norman, that probably many of you know about, and I got together and we're thinking about this whole thing from a design point of view, from a research point of view, and think that there was really a need to transform kind of a design and research education. So we started this whole new initiative that's been going for the last couple of years. And that's actually going to be publishing the results early next year in a special issue journal of looking at all the ways that design and research education needs to sort of level up, which also importantly includes not just the practitioners. It's as important in MBA programs. I teach in an MBA program to make sure that people that are coming out of business schools, out of engineering schools, can understand the importance of and how to use research and also design and really be able to not just call in some other discipline, but actually be able to sort of live and breathe this. And the experience that we often get when we hire people into a company is that people come out of a business school and they think they're the center of the universe, right? Because they're the ones that are going to look at the financials, in it. And then you've got the engineer that thinks they're the center of the universe because they build the thing, right? And designers think they're the center of the universe because they're actually creating that experience. And the researchers come in and say, well, they're going to understand what it is that people need. Of course, all of those disciplines need to work more effectively together, and they all have to know each of their terminology and their biases and work more effectively together. It's one of the biggest challenges we have. 10 years ago, we created a boot camp inside the company that I've been quoted as calling the missing semester of school, of university, that basically did that to bring these disciplines together and really start to work together and the like as well. So I think where we need to go is rise up the importance of research do research thinking across the board, and actually make sure that all the adjacent disciplines actually know how to work with researchers, and we with them, by the way, equally, that we as researchers understand business, that we understand something about engineering and the like as well. So I think it's a bigger picture, broadening view.
Right. Yeah, I think that point of every field has the chart, which puts that field at the center, is always a funny one. I'd say maybe researchers are maybe the one group that doesn't actually always put themselves at the center of that world. So I think it's part of the humility and thoughtfulness of this field, which is such a draw. Also, Regine, Karel's got you can start a whole program at NYU now. Work with Karel to kind of get it rolling. I feel like you could chair a department here. So, Regine, we'll wrap up with your word. When you kind of think about the field and kind of adaptation, what's kind of your keyword or phrase for the next few years?
I'm gonna borrow a phrase that is often said in the disability world. Nothing about us without us. Nothing about us without us. So one of the things that I hope to see in the future is that there's a lot more community involvement in the research, not just, one of the things that one of the courses I teach is an assistive technology course, and we instill in the students that you're not designing for anyone, you're designing with them. And so I think there's an opportunity for us as researchers to get the communities that we're working with involved so that people aren't feeling exploited or left out. I think that's a really key consideration to think about. Who are we excluding from the very beginning? We have these ideas about what we want to create, but are we forgetting anyone? And so we have a great opportunity to move forward by working within the communities and having people work with us as well. And that way we're coming up with something that will actually work for them.
That's beautifully said. I love the idea of a shift from for to with as kind of an inspiring way to kind of think about where the field can go. And certainly it's a way to kind of talk about, from my own perspective, kind of what we feel like when we put on an event like People Nerds, that we very much feel like this is a community. We hope you feel like this event was often put on with you. I think that almost all of the content was sourced directly from people in this community, and certainly we want to know if there are topics that you want us to explore more and further, whether it's through our writing or the next time we do an event together. I do want to thank you, our panelists today, so much for your wisdom and time and thoughtfulness and bringing it home as we kind of wrap up what has been a really incredible and special day. I really want to thank all of our speakers, our panelists throughout the day for sharing your wisdom and thought. As I said right at the start, you're what makes this community so special, right? This is such a thoughtful group of people. Every time I see and hear from you, I feel like I'm just reminded of the good people that really are at the heart of what we're all doing together. So thank you.